Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Ken Medlock. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Studies here. We are gathered today to talk about approaches to climate policy and in particular address one particular proposal that is on the table that you'll hear a lot about, which is a carbon tax. And for those of you who follow this space know very well that the namesake of this institute came out very profoundly not too long ago and advocated a tax on carbon as an approach to dealing with a policy approach to dealing with climate. There are, of course, many proposals on the table, and there have been. This is not a new topic. Just because it's not a new topic, though, doesn't mean it's not a topic worth engaging, and doesn't mean it's not a topic that gets people stirred up a little bit. But that's actually a good thing. Having vested interest in the outcome is really what drives a lot of that discourse. And one of the things we hope to continue to do here at the Baker Institute, as we do in other domains, is be right in the middle of the conversation. At the end of the day, when you can bring data to bear on very important issues, you can often elevate the conversation without necessarily advocating an outcome. And anytime you can elevate the conversation out of the muck, you end up with a much better outcome. So with that, I want to just take a moment to introduce the individuals who you'll be hearing from today. I'll be moderating a panel discussion following a few opening remarks. We'll first hear from Mary Lou Hastings, who's the Vice President of the Sustainability Programs at the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Then we'll hear briefly from Bob Inglis, who's the Executive Director of Energy and Enterprise Initiative at George Mason University. He's also held fellowships at Harvard, Duke, and Chicago, and has had a position on Capitol Hill, which I'm sure he'll elaborate on. But as you'll hear, not only Bob, but Katrina and Jason have all been involved at some level in the sausage making that goes on in Washington. So having the three of them here is actually a pretty unique opportunity, particularly in this discussion. On the panel, we'll be joined by Bob as well as Jason Albritton, who is the Director of Climate and Energy Policy at the Nature Conservancy. He's been involved again on Capitol Hill. He was a senior policy advisor for the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Affairs in his previous life. Katrina Rourke will also join us. She's a senior fellow for policy at Deploy USA, or US, sorry. She actually has known Bob for years because she was his legislative assistant and was actually involved in drafting legislation aimed at addressing carbon. And then, of course, we'll hear from Jim Blackburn, who has risen to significant fame in the Houston area recently for a lot of his work related to dealing with or flood mitigation in particular. But he's got some really interesting approaches that are related to monetizing ecosystem services, which is something that he's been very involved with. And I think we'll hear about some of that in his remarks today. But really what it boils down to, which is a very Texas way of thinking, making ecosystem services a monetizable property right, which is an interesting way to think about things. Jim is a professor in practice in civil and environmental engineering, and he's a scholar here at the Baker Institute, as well as being very active in environmental law. So with that, I will have a seat and hand it over to Mary Lou.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, everybody, for being here. There's only one Houstonian that's more famous than Jim Blackburn. You can probably guess who I'm going to say, George P. Mitchell, who I'm going to assume in this crowd, in this city, you all know who that is. So I'm not going to go through all the background that I have to tell everyone when I go to New York and they say, oh, do you work for the senator? So here, at last, I can say, other than Jim Blackburn, I work for the late, almost more famous than Jim, George Mitchell. So for now, I work for his family, his children, who make up the board of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. We're located in Austin, and we have several programs all focused on sustainability. The 10 Mitchell children made a commitment to continue Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell's legacy on funding sustainability, and we're focused strictly in Texas. Our grantees don't have to be in Texas, but they have to inform Texas resources, Texas decision makers, other Texas academics, et cetera. I won't spend a lot of time going through I won't spend any time actually going through the whole foundation. I think we're talking about climate and clean energy here, so I'll tell you the 3 tenets of our clean energy program, and then I will sit down so the good people and famous people can come up and talk to you. It's an honor to be here with the 4 folks on the panel because we have funded them in one way or another over the years or had a relationship with them. Katrina's former organization, R Street, Jim Blackburn and I go way back decades, and we continue to work with Jim on all sorts of issues. TNC has been a grantee, and Bob Inglis is one of our newest grantees, and his work motivating and informing particularly conservative audiences about clean energy and climate. So the 3 things I want to say very briefly that are just like little thought clouds for you that really guide our clean energy program. And one is the state of Texas has done a tremendous job on cleaning up our power sector in terms of carbon emissions. And we did this over the past little over about 20 years, starting with Governor Bush, then Governor Perry, very conservative gentlemen, very conservative legislatures. We had early energy policies like our renewable portfolio standards and energy efficiency requirements. We made $7 billion of investment in transmission lines that brought West Texas wind into Houston and other places. We deregulated our market so that Texas consumers are actually able to see price differences between renewables and fossil fuels. And we continue to make strides in building codes. We hope to make better strides in energy efficiency. But we recognize at the foundation, while we embrace the power of conservative voices and conservative leadership, that they can make remarkable progress in clean energy and climate. But we recognize and we own the fact that we're not going to get to clean energy and climate protection the way they might do in California, for instance. We need to embrace the way we do things here in Texas. We need to package it. We need to extend the power of the market into other sectors beyond power. We need to look at transportation. We need to look at industrial emissions, particularly in Houston. And we need to do that nationally. We need to show other states that are conservative. We have a very conservative country, and we need to bring the power of the market to those other sectors and other states. The best way to do that, or one of the best ways to do that, we believe, is through carbon pricing. You can have a carbon tax, you can have a cap and trade system, you can have the type of system that Jim's going to talk to you about. But the best, most efficient, most systemic approach that you can take to addressing climate change and promoting clean energy is with carbon pricing. And it's very market friendly, and it is anti-regulatory. So what's better for Texas than that type of approach? The third one I will mention, the other tenet that drives our clean energy program that's unique among all clean energy and climate funders across the country, is that we are not obsessed with carbon. We do not embrace policies that have carbon reduction as the only metric. So what does that mean? We look at the TNC's, the Nature Conservancy's excellent work on energy sprawl. The loss of land, open land right now, is estimated by TNC to be the largest use. Energy sprawl is the largest use of undeveloped land now. Nature Conservancy estimates that by 2030, in 13 years, 20% of existing surviving open space will be used for energy. That's the size of Russia. So that's Latin America, that's Africa. Energy is one of the largest users of water, from fracking, so-called fracking, coal mining, burning coal, burning gas, shipping it, heating water. It's all energy, and it's one of the largest users of water in human development. So we use a metric that is beyond just carbon molecules to say what we promote, what we fund. So I will leave you with that. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very anxious to hear what you all have to say, and we'll be learning along with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Lou. It's wonderful to be here. You know, we wouldn't be here but for Mary Lou and the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. So we're on this 10-city, actually turned out to be 11 cities, in 10-week tour. We call it the Encourage Tour. And so we thank you very much for making it possible for us to be here. And you may wonder why Rice and why that speech. But I will tell you that when I get discouraged in this effort, where I go to see, or the thing I go to watch, is the 17 minutes of pure American exceptionalism in that speech. If you haven't seen the whole of it lately, you'll want to Google it. Rice, JFK, September of '62. It's 17 minutes of absolute pure American exceptionalism. He admits in the speech that some of the materials needed for the spacecraft hadn't been invented yet. No matter, we're going to the moon before the decade is out. And then that great line, there's so many great lines, but the great line you just heard there, the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. I got to tell you, I'm a Republican, but I don't think any Republican has ever done American exceptionalism as well as JFK. I'm not sure the Kennedy family appreciates it, but I like to say, especially in connection with the Profile and Courage Award, I told them this like this: he was a tax-cutting, communist-fighting, ask-not kind of guy. I think it makes him a pretty good Republican. I don't know why they don't like that so much, but apparently they don't like that Republican thing at the end of it. So, but if you think about it, that's really sort of who he was. A tax-cutting, communist-fighting, ask-not kind of guy. And so so that's why we're at Rice. We wanted to come here to sort of revisit the incredible spirit of the moonshot speech given right here in September of '62, and to really be part of calling the nation to the same kind of moment in our times. You know, that was him responding to Sputnik being launched. But we at republicen.org believe that we have a slow and silent Sputnik now in climate change. And oh, that climate change could just put on some boots and goose step through a red square somewhere. Maybe then we could bring America together and say, that's the enemy, that's the one we've got to defeat. But it's slow and it's silent, but it's clearly happening. And so, but here's the thing. Conservatives, we're after conservatives. You know, our whole branding is we're called republicen.org, right? And I'm going to get my friend Carolyn over here. I'm going to put her to work and get her to hand those out to you so you can see the kind of things that we're branding. But the thing that we're engaging conservatives, right, on climate change. This is what we hear from conservatives. This is what conservatives think about climate change. It's going to take a bigger government to solve it. They also tell us that they've heard that what we need to do is repent and do with less, maybe sit in sackcloth and ashes a little bit. They've heard that fixing climate change will destroy the American economy. They've heard that China and India are going to go right on pumping out the CO2, so it really doesn't matter. And they've heard that essentially there's nothing that can be done about it. That's what conservatives have heard. That's what they tell us. So if you're a conservative here, you can relax, because I'm here to tell you from republicen.org the exact opposite of all those things. We think this is going to take a slightly smaller government to fix climate change. Because we think that in pricing carbon dioxide, as Mary Lou just mentioned, that we can actually repeal some Clean Air Act regulations that would become redundant. Not the entirety of the Clean Air Act, clearly, but some parts of the Clean Air Act regulations would become redundant. So you can repeal them. A slightly smaller EPA, slightly smaller federal government can solve the problem of climate change. Rather than repenting and doing with less, we think this is about more energy, more mobility, and more freedom, that it's about abundance. And that's why we're particularly excited to have the support of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, because we're rather unusual in this space. We think fracking is great. We think pipelines are fine. We think nuclear is great. We're for lots of energy at republicen.org. That was reassuring last night to some petroleum engineers at Texas A&M, next door to the Mitchell building down there. And so we're a little bit unusual in the space, right, in saying that sort of thing. But we're here to tell you, if you're a conservative, that it's not going to be us doing with less. It's actually more energy, more mobility, more freedom. Rather than destroying the American economy, we think it's an incredible opportunity to expand the American economy, that we will, if we play this right, create an awful lot of wealth as we spread distributed energy systems around the world and light up the world with more energy, more mobility, more freedom. We think that China and India, contrary to what we're hearing and conservatives have heard, is that they'll go right on. We think with an effective border adjustment on our carbon tax, that actually we can get China and India in on this deal without any international agreement. Just a win in the World Trade Organization that the content tax imposed on imports from other countries would be permissible under GATT. We think there's a good case for that. And if we win it, then without any international agreement, the whole world joins us. If I could just explain that for a moment, the reason we think that is, right now there's a sheet of flat steel coming through the port of Houston, maybe from a Chinese state-run industry. We impose the carbon tax there. They object, saying that it's an impermissible tariff. We think we win that case based on precedents in the chemical industry and the World Trade Organization. 24 hours later, China, because they have an amazing way of reaching consensus, would impose the same price on carbon dioxide. Why? They're paying at the port of Houston a tax that's being sent to Washington that they could have collected in China, in which case the money would have ended up in Beijing. 24 hours later, they get the same price on carbon dioxide. And then the whole world follows. No international agreement. Just a bold move by the United States saying, you want access to this market? Fine, we love your goods. It's just you're going to pay the carbon tax on entry. And then we've got the whole world. Because those that object and say that if America only goes to a true costing of energy, the rest of the world doesn't, they're right. That would be a sure loser. A double loser, in fact. You lose employment, plus you lose the race to reduce global emissions. So you got to get the rest of the world in on. We think it's possible. And so quite contrary to that last thing about how there's nothing we can do about it, there's everything we can do about it. We run some Facebook ads. I'm going to see if this one, that whether you all like it or not, it's playing to mixed reviews, okay? So it's one that I came up with myself, okay? It's about whether we can do anything about this, right? And so I searched for images of sinners in the hands of an angry God. And I found this image of a guy that looks like he's really preaching, right? Looks like he's got a Bible in his hand. He's really like preaching like this, right? Fuzzed up, it really looks pretty ominous. And so the ad has climate change written in these dark storm clouds, lightning bolt coming down around this image. The tagline is, we better hope it's human caused. You like it? In other words, yes, there's everything we can do about it. We better hope it's human caused. If it's not, we are hosed. But if it is of human cause, like JFK says in another speech that's famous of his, these problems are of human origin. They are open to human solution. And so we have every reason to be confident that America can respond as America did right here at Rice when a president called us to respond to Sputnik and to get to the moon before the Soviets did, that we can get to an answer on climate change and actually bring the country together to do just that. One last thing I'd tell you before we get to the panel is that, there's been a lot of talk about the war on coal. And I like Mary Lou to talk about George Mitchell in connection with the war on coal, because the idea is, maybe it was Barack Obama doing a war on coal. Not so important maybe here in Texas, but it is in other places where we spend time, like Kentucky and West Virginia and Montana and Wyoming. And so what I like to tell them is, at the end of Saving Private Ryan, the film, there's a point at which the captain is down on the ground, he's got a handgun, and he's shooting at the tank coming at him. You know the scene I'm talking about in Saving Private Ryan? And so I like to tell people, if there's a war on coal, the guy on the ground, the captain, is Barack Obama, and he's got a little handgun out, and it's called the Clean Power Plant. It's a little pop gun he's shooting. The guy in the tank is George Mitchell, and he fired something called fracking at the coal industry. And that's why 6 coal-fired plants in South Carolina, for example, converted or are in the process of converting to natural gas. Because human ingenuity, the kind that JFK was calling for here in Houston in September of '62, human ingenuity came up with a way to get more natural gas out of mines, out of wells, with the result that supply was expanded, price came down, and it became possible for 6 coal-fired plants, for example, in South Carolina to convert. 50% less CO2, less small particulates. We're breathing better in South Carolina, and we've got less climate damages because of George Mitchell and because of that human ingenuity. Will it be the end of the line? I don't think so. In fact, I had a wonderful opportunity to be with my friends at the Woodlands and to go to see the ExxonMobil headquarters last year with my friend Peter Brenn. Peter, who used to be an engineer at ExxonMobil, and he showed me the history of ExxonMobil that's on the wall there at the Cube. It goes from John D. Rockefeller doing some things, and then the Exxon Valdez, unfortunately, right in the middle. And then it gets, the last thing on the wall, if you've been there, has a reference to hydrogen. If I were on the board of ExxonMobil, I'd be telling them at every board meeting, you know what? If we can get to that hydrogen thing, we got a future. But if we don't, there's a guy named Elon Musk who's out to destroy our business. Because at some point, he may electrify the fleet. And if he does, petroleum isn't going to have the value that it has right now. We got some natural gas, though, and we can convert it, reform it into hydrogen if we can beat Elon Musk to that technology. And what I'd be calling on that board to do all the time is you cannot assume that a product you've got now will be able to be sold for decades into the future. You simply cannot assume it. You've got to figure out a way to use your expertise and the human ingenuity in your ranks to figure out the new and the next. Because what I'd be saying to that board is that the railroads could have become airlines. People won't fly. They had the capital, they had the know-how, they were in the business of moving people. People won't fly. They made the wrong bet. And so ExxonMobil, you got a great business right now, and I'm really happy because my 94-year-old dad is a teeny-weeny shareholder of ExxonMobil, and I hope they make $1 bazillion. That's another difference between us and most people in the environmental community that work on climate change. We celebrate ExxonMobil's support of a carbon tax, and we reference them all the time. I hope they make a bunch of money, but I also hope they don't stop, because you just can't stop where you are. I got to believe, if John D. Rockefeller were still alive, he'd probably be figuring out solar and better batteries at this point. Because more than being about oil, he was about entrepreneurship. He was about inventing things and making money. And so we got an incredible opportunity, we think. It's about creating a free enterprise opportunity here. It's not about government regulation. It's not about growing the government. It's about freeing the free enterprise system to solve this challenge. Particularly excited, just in closing here, to be at the Baker Center because I am so grateful for Secretary Baker and Schultz and Paulson for forming the Climate Leadership Council. It's really important that they're signaling to official Washington that really senior statesmen who know these things know that it's time to innovate. And so it's particularly great to be here at Rice because of the moonshot speech and to be here because of Secretary Baker and his leadership and the difference he's making on this issue. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, so those remarks from Bob, I think, will serve as his remarks for the panel. What I'd like to do now is actually invite, and we'll start at the end with Katrina, but the rest of our panelists to make some remarks. I believe that Jim is the only one that has actually a formal presentation. So, Jim, I'm going to invite you to the podium actually to do that if you choose to. But with that, Katrina.
Sure. So, Mary Lou and Bob brought up a couple things that I want to touch on. Mary Lou talked about bringing the power of the market to other sectors. I want to talk about why the market's so important. And Bob talked about how John D. Rockefeller would be innovating hydrogen and batteries today. Actually, he had a battery electric vehicle, which I think is remarkable. But it's at his old estate up in Pecanico, New York. So if you have the opportunity, you can go look at a really old battery electric vehicle. Because he believed in innovation, and he certainly wouldn't have stopped at one fuel. So let's talk about markets. I guess we can talk about markets when it comes to carbon mitigation, and how carbon tax is a nice alternative. Markets don't put floors or ceilings on things that they don't have to. I believe in markets for the same reason I believe in evolution. Markets are going to come up with better things than any intelligent designer could, because nobody has to hold all the knowledge. You don't have one set of preferences expressed. You have the creativity of the marketplace working on a problem. And that's why a carbon tax is a superior alternative to something like the Climate Action Plan from the Obama administration, even cap and trade regulations that say we need to reduce carbon this much at this pace over this period. Because those solutions just don't embrace creativity. And creativity and ingenuity, they've solved every crisis we've hit so far, and they'll solve this one too. So let's talk about how markets impact both mitigation and adaptation. We can talk about carbon pricing until the cows come home, but I'll leave my comments there. Markets can help expand electric competition. Texas, of course, has been exemplary in this. Not only has competition in Texas allowed for prices to go down right now while energy's cheap, but it lets you pick what kind of electrons you want. And that's pretty unusual when it comes to the rest of the country. We don't see a terrible amount of opportunity to express preferences for cheap electrons from renewable sources. So the Texas model works. Expedited permitting stands in the way of using the vast land holdings of the United States to deploy renewable resources. That's government standing in the way of good solutions. That's government preventing the market from working quickly. Both Canada and Australia take 2 years to get from an application to construction on land holdings. I think if the United States starts thinking that way, gets government out of the way, we'll see a lot more resources come to bear on public lands. Sure, not all of them will be renewable, but some of them will. That's where the money's at today, and we're holding it back. And now I want to talk about adaptation, because I think everybody in this room knows that climate change, it's real, it's happening, it's human-caused, and a little bit of it is inevitable no matter what we do today. And this is where markets are especially important, because the best solution to climate change is wealth. And if we don't use markets to solve problems, we're keeping ourselves from being richer in the future. I can tell you that rich people, they can survive climate change. If we make more people more rich, we've got a better chance at making it through at a developed world that's more equitable and where people can continue to thrive no matter what the environmental conditions are. And secondly, I think markets are really great because the government spends a lot of money on stupid things. Federal government deploys resources to make sure we keep burning coal. The federal government spends money so that private companies can deploy technologies that are regulated and required. The federal government actually pays for empty planes to traverse the United States to serve airports that nobody goes to anymore. The market has solved all of these things. The federal government is dumping money on them for no good reason. This is again where the government can learn that the market is a pretty good problem solver, can probably back off a little bit. Now, however great the market is, we're not going to be able to get to market-based solutions unless we build political will. In this Congress, so since January, 54 Republican members have either joined the Climate Solutions Caucus, co-sponsored a resolution saying we need action on climate change, or affirmed the Pentagon's interest in appraising climate risk. That's almost a quarter of House Republicans, and that's in this Congress with this president in this political time. This is a pretty big tip of the spear for potential action. These are people who want to solve problems related to climate change and clean energy, but they want to do it with conservative solutions, and they need to hear from people. So I got a couple of ideas. You can listen to Bob. You can get in. He's got pins. They're pretty great. It's likely that your neighbor in this audience is a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. You can talk to them about getting involved. But most importantly, we need more creative solutions. Carbon tax is great. Electricity markets are great. But what's next? Be part of the market. Be part of identifying solutions, because we haven't figured out what the right answer is yet politically, and more creativity will help us do that. Thanks.
Jim?
Yeah, I'll skip the slides and just go straight from here. I want to talk about nature as a solution to at least a part of this problem. One of the things that I've been kind of concerned about with carbon tax, frankly, is that we may not be actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It may just be a cost of doing business, and you just continue putting the carbon up. And at some point, we need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so I've been working, started off as a flood control solution, trying to figure out how to save our ranches to let them be flooded by hurricane surge and keep them from being broken up and ultimately developed. If we don't develop down in the low-lying coastal areas, we won't have flood damage. Well, how are we going to do that? And we started looking at markets that were out there and found that the ecosystem services that are provided by nature might, in fact, generate a lot of income for these landowners. And of all of the potentials, the potential for removal of carbon dioxide and storing it in the soil just emerged at the top of the list almost immediately. You can get several tons of carbon dioxide removed per acre per year with ranch land, with prairie lands that are managed in certain ways. And we have been trying to figure out how to set up a system to basically incentivize the oil and gas industry, or to convince the oil and gas industry to pay for the carbon. With a tax, I think if we could substitute the payment at $40 a ton to buying $40 a ton credits to put it into the soil, and if the ranchers could get that $40 a ton, we could basically, I think, do tremendous land use sequestration of carbon. And I think it could be part of a long-term solution to the carbon dioxide problem. I think the oil industry is facing a real crisis with or without the carbon tax, in the sense that there's what I would call the carbon neutral movement. And now there's a coalition of cities that have become carbon neutral. There's a number of companies that have pledged to be carbon neutral in the future. I think Monsanto has notably pledged to be carbon neutral by 2021. There's any number of other companies that are partially or fully committed to that. And you can get there three ways. You can avoid carbon emissions by substituting fuel sources. You can minimize by efficiency movements, or you can mitigate by either carbon capture and deep storage or by sequestration in soil and timber. And really, of those last options, right now, carbon capture and storage is not looking very good from a scale standpoint and from a cost standpoint. And what we're looking at with basically carbon capture and storage is the technology. And we can improve on that technology a bit by certain grazing techniques that replicate the action of the buffalo. But we're figuring that there's probably 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide that can be stored in the nation's soils. It may end up converting some of the cropland from feed corn that goes for animal feed back into pasture. And turns out McDonald's is real interested in grass-fed beef from a health standpoint. So there's a number of trends that are coming together that I think make the whole concept of storing carbon dioxide in the soil a very reasonable proposition for the future. Right now, though, the carbon marketing systems that exist, the Voluntary Carbon System, VCS, American Carbon Registry, ACR, the California system that's set up, they're draconian in their terms and conditions on landowners to the point we don't have a single grassland project in the United States that's qualified under any of those programs. And we need to mobilize the grasslands of the United States and the ranching community of the United States to solve this problem. And we think we can by a system to allow the buying and selling of carbon dioxide under, I would say, relaxed rules from what is basically required under the Kyoto Protocol, which is essentially the source of all of the carbon rules that we have today that are out there in the trading systems. And the big, I think, important takeaway is we think that if you grow carbon in your soil, it's a property. It's a property right. You own the carbon you grow. And if you measure it, and if you prove you've added it to the inventory, we believe that you can sell it. And so we want to create carbon as basically a private property right, a commodity. And we think we can set up a system that every red state in the country would accept in a heartbeat. Whether we can get it accepted in California, that's a different question. But I think there are market solutions, and I think there's creative ways of going forward if we can all figure out how to work together and do it. And so that's what we're working on. We call it the Texas Coastal Exchange. We're at the point of soliciting investors, and nobody wants to buy that much carbon dioxide right now. But it turns out if you look at this from a supply and demand standpoint and project that there is going to be a market that will emerge, there is actually a limited commodity called storable carbon, if you will, from the standpoint of the amount of soil that's available out there to store. And so what we're offering is essentially preferential access rights to carbon dioxide in the future if you will invest and help us develop the system today. We've got some interest. We have not got investors yet. Any of you want to put a bunch of money in? We'll be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Jason?
Thanks. It's a very interesting panel. Excited for the discussion. I'm going to try to be pretty brief, and hopefully we can get to the conversation. Just a little bit about the Nature Conservancy where I work. Mary Lou, it's nice to call out some of the work that we've been doing, but we're a global organization working in about 70 countries as well as all 50 states here in the U.S., and we're a science-based organization. And so we come to the climate change issue because of our belief that the science shows that it's a challenge and it's affecting the conservation priorities that we as a conservation organization care about. And it's become one of our top priorities in an organization to try to deal with. Our work covers a pretty broad spectrum of issues of what I would call in the climate space, from adaptation to the mitigation side, to some of the land sequestration side that we just heard about. So just highlight a few examples to kind of give you a little flavor of that work. Our energy sprawl work is something that was previously highlighted to look at where we're siting energy and how that deals with conservation, which actually will be a critical issue issue as renewable deployment happens and where that gets sited and how that is put on the ground. We're working in coastal communities around the world on sea level rise and looking at how nature can help deal with some of those impacts. We've done a lot of work in what he was just talking about that we call natural climate solutions, which is how do we use nature to sequester carbon to really provide part of the solution to getting emissions, to dealing with the climate change problem and reducing emissions. And we're working on policies like carbon pricing, which I'll talk a little bit more here in a second. In the U.S., to deal with this challenge, I think just speaking from a political perspective, we think you're going to need broad bipartisan support to achieve any kind of durable solution. And that means support across the political spectrum. And so with this kind of notion in mind, we're working with interests across the political spectrum to find solutions and build a bipartisan consensus on how you can address this challenge. We're also working through what we call our 50-state strategy, which involves working with each of our 50 state chapters across the U.S. to find the best way in each state to advance clean energy and address climate change, recognizing that success at the national level will be built from the states up, from the good ideas developed at the state level. And our state chapters are unique a bit in the environmental and conservation world because they've been working in many of these communities for decades. They have deep relationships. They're governed by boards of volunteer trustees, which are community leaders, business leaders, academics, and other experts in their field, and they help us, and they come from across the political spectrum, conservatives, liberals, but that kind of diversity helps us kind of look for solutions that can try to bridge that divide. And so now let me move a little bit into the policy and what we're working on and what we see as some of the solutions. I think it's first important to recognize that the trends we're seeing in renewable energy deployment, energy efficiency, are moving towards a low-carbon future. There's no question about that. The market's driving that. State policy is driving that. But to get to the depth of emissions reductions that are likely needed to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change, additional policy is likely going to be needed to drive those reductions. We at the national level think that a price on carbon, which you've already heard a ton about, will ultimately be needed. Said much more eloquently than I can say, I mean, we believe a market-based policy is the best approach, the most efficient approach to getting these emissions reductions. We as an organization haven't picked any particular carbon pricing model as the ultimate solution, but we're working in a lot of different conversations, both at the state level and nationally. We've worked on everything from cap-and-trade systems in RGGI in California, RGGI being the Northeast power sector cap-and-trade system, to carbon tax in Washington. So a variety of different of mechanisms for putting a price on carbon. And federally, we're pretty realistic that the chances of any action, particularly in Congress in the near term, are quite slim, but it doesn't mean it's not the time to have the conversation about what the solutions can be and start that conversation about how to bridge the divide that's taken hold on this issue in the country by bringing different interests and stakeholders together to see where common ground can be found and momentum can be built for moving forward. One such initiative, which I think is particularly relevant, has already been mentioned today, is the Climate Leadership Council, which Secretary Baker was obviously very instrumental in launching. The Nature Conservancy joined as a founding member of that organization in June of this year, along with a variety of major leading U.S. corporations from the oil and gas sector, auto manufacturing, and consumer products. And that group's four-part cap and dividend plan prices carbon, distributes revenues back to taxpayers while rolling back some existing regulations that become redundant in the wake of that. And we believe it's an important effort, not because every detail of that is perfect, but because we think it brings new voices, particularly conservative voices, as Bob was talking about, business voices into the conversation about what solutions can be. And that's where we try to be and we try to operate. We're also working with a lot of leading companies on an individual basis just to talk about how could a price on carbon work and what is the business case for doing that to try to foster that conversation about solutions within the corporate sector as well. And beyond carbon pricing, we're working on other complementary policies that we think will be important, such as modernizing the electric grid, which we think is not always policy-based, but is something that's kind of an important precursor to deployment of additional technologies, low-carbon technologies in the future. And we're working, as I said at the beginning, not just at the federal level, but in all 50 states to advance both climate policy, but also clean energy policy and deployment of clean energy. And those policies are quite diverse and really depend on the state that they're in. So they range from renewable tax incentives to green financing banks to renewable portfolio standards to grid modernization, which I mentioned, net metering, and again, carbon pricing. But it's a mix of things that are happening at the state level right now. And what we're finding in our work through the 50 states is that state governments, where a lot of the activity is currently occurring on clean energy in the kind of vacuum that's happening, or in place of the vacuum that's happening in Washington right now. And that's why TNC is doing things like we partnered with a group out of Colorado called the Center for the New Energy Economy, which helped us develop a tool to really track this and see what's going on. It's called the State Policy Opportunity Tracker. We call it SPOT for short, but it's a web-based tool that looks at all of the clean energy policies implemented in states to see what a state has done, what gaps may be, what opportunities may be, to really provide a roadmap for opportunities, a menu of options that policymakers, that regulators, that interested stakeholders can look at to try to look at options for proceeding in a state. So these are just a small touch on some of the things that are out there as far as policy options to deal with this issue and the things we're working on. I just want to close and get to the discussion here by saying that, we're seeing, as I said, a move in this direction. The market's driving a move towards lower carbon energy sources. Renewable energy is growing at a pretty unprecedented pace, and it's doing it at a time of economic growth. So it's showing that it can be done. But without additional policy support and policy driver, the projections are the depth of emission reductions are needed to really avoid the worst impacts probably won't be achieved. And that's why it needs support, and it can be market-based solution support as a price on carbon is that can drive this and can get us to the place that allows the new technologies and deployment of the innovative solutions that will really address this problem, and that's what we're working toward. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason. So I'm going to sort of launch into a couple of questions that I'd like each of you to address sort of in turn, and then we'll turn to the audience because I'm sure there are questions that you have. But I find it remarkable, and this is always the case, whenever there's a discussion about carbon policy, how many different things we end up touching on. So the sort of what seems like age-old debate now about adaptation versus mitigation has surfaced. What's the appropriate approach to pricing carbon has surfaced. What's the appropriate market-oriented tool to use has surfaced. And I raise all this because, and I was actually joking with Jason before the session started, a little over a year ago, we had some conversations here at the Baker Institute with the Nature Conservancy about holding a series of workshops to address that latter issue specifically. What's the appropriate mechanism for pricing carbon? You don't want to presume an answer necessarily sort of leading into that discussion. But everything sort of got put on hold because the political world in the U.S. was thrown for a major loop. Because these conversations we were having were back in August of last year. And August of last year, you forget how time flies, but nobody in their right mind was believing that Trump would be president. It was sort of a very sort of different view of the world, if you will. And so a lot of what colored the conversation was an existing administration that was pushing forward with a clean power plan and potentially an incoming administration that would continue along that path. Of course, everything changed overnight, literally. But as I told some of my students actually at the time that got a little bit disheartened by the outcome of the election, I said, look, that's one of the things that makes this country great is we're literally counting votes in counties in Minnesota to figure out who the next president's going to be. Everybody's vote mattered. And so when you think about that, you realize very quickly that next cycle, things could change rather dramatically yet again. Because of that, it's very important to have these types of conversations, because you can't ever let something, just because it's not in the main discourse in Washington at a particular moment in time, you can't let it get stale. The conversation has to remain very robust, and so that's why I'm actually very glad we're hosting this event, as well as other events we've actually done over the past couple of years, particularly around luncheons, addressing various issues related to climate mitigation, climate adaptation, climate policy in general. With all that said, there are some interesting threads, I think, that can be pulled through everything everybody said. And I'll just throw this out there because, and not necessarily for you to comment on, because I think it's worth, thinking about. Jim's notion through the Coastal Exchange is to create a market-oriented solution where you can monetize property rights through the ecosystem service value that they provide. And what that basically means is that you have oil and gas companies buying those property rights or paying for those property rights because they basically serve as a sequestration avenue. What's interesting about that, and I don't think this connection was made, is that when you're writing tax policy, you can actually put in methods to avoid tax payments. One such method might be the use of this type of exchange. And I think that's kind of a novel way to think about potentially promoting the distribution of wealth a little bit differently, potentially promoting economic activity through the provision of ecosystem services and land use changes a little bit differently. So I think that's something that should be on the table and I think should be discussed. I think it's a mistake to just focus on if this, then that, then not that. Because in a lot of cases, you can figure out ways to merge these potential solutions and potentially make a much more robust outcome. And the reason I raise that, and this sort of leads to a question that I'd like all of you to address. When you start talking about tax policy or, tax policy specifically, or even a cap and trade type system where there's revenues that are generated and ultimately taxes are paid on those revenues, or on those profits, depending on who's making the profit. But there is a stream of revenue that goes to the government. And the fundamental question, this is where the devil's in the details, what do you do with it? I know there's been discussion about revenue neutrality. As a matter of fact, Secretary Baker, that's one of the big tenets of one of the major talking points of his proposal. But we all know, and he'd tell you the same thing, because I've had conversations, the sausage making is not pretty. And it's not always necessarily true that you get exactly what you're after. And so you get to a point where how do you guarantee that the revenues that are received as a result of a tax program, for example, are actually used in the way they originally intended? And so some of these things that have been floated, it's not just revenue neutrality. There have also been ideas floated about funding clean energy initiatives, ideas floated about funding infrastructure resilience initiatives, and these are aimed at adaptation. So it sort of opens Pandora's box, right, when you start thinking about these tax revenues. How should they actually be used, and what's the most efficient way to use them, particularly when you're thinking about avoiding potential social costs associated with the tax and with climate change specifically? So I'll just start with you, Katrina, if you want to.
Down here. So I want to be responsive to this question, but first I'm going to say that I think this conversation is relevant even with the White House as it is today, even with Congress as it is today. And for one particular reason, and that is that almost every piece of major environmental legislation in the United States has passed into law when the Republican brand has been both dominant and damaged. And there's no opportunity like today if you think that way. Back to being efficient with revenues. A carbon tax is a consumption tax. Consumption taxes disproportionately impact people on the lower end of the income spectrum. And so if you care about equity, you're going to want to do something about that. A carbon tax is also much more narrow than a tax on something like income, which means it disproportionately affects certain sectors of the economy. If you care about carbon emissions, that's a good thing. And there are plenty of ways that you can pull out all of the different imperatives associated with reducing the negative impacts of switching to a carbon taxation system, of switching to the negative impacts of climate change itself, facilitating the economy and in adopting newer technologies at a faster pace, making up for lost coal jobs. Pandora's box is bottomless. And so as somebody who no longer works on the Hill, I like to not negotiate with myself. And I think it's best to advocate for policies that are simple and easy to understand. At the R Street Institute, Mary Lou mentioned where I used to work, we talked about using carbon tax revenues to just eliminate the corporate income tax entirely. You don't need a very high carbon tax to do that. With Bob, we talked about buying down the payroll tax so that every person takes home more money in their paycheck. Citizens Climate Lobby and Climate Leadership Council, is that one right? Gosh, there's so many. They talk about a dividend, so a check goes out to every American household. These are policies that are really easy to understand. These are policies that are really easy to talk about. And so I like to avoid sausage making when I'm giving people on the Hill ideas, because hopefully they have fewer bad ones. And just say, let's advocate for things that are simple and straightforward, and let all of the political proclivities mess it up on the other side.
Bob.
At Republican.org, we're very ecumenical about what to do with the revenue from a carbon tax. We're for all the ones that Katrina just mentioned. For corporate income tax reduction, individual income tax reduction, payroll tax reduction, or a dividend. Any of those are fine with us.
Yep. I mean, I've stated the worry that I have is that we're not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I mean, one thought would be to take the tax revenue that comes in and turn it into a strategic carbon reserve for the United States, where you pay the farmers to actually store the carbon dioxide and take that payment and just put it from the government bag, much in the way that we did the Strategic Petroleum Reserve some time back, and basically making it a national priority in terms of expenditure. But I really want to see that private sector set up, and if we can get that substitutions that you mentioned, Ken, if we could get that set up, I mean, every rancher I've talked about, I mean, it's hard to get a rancher to tell you how much money's enough money, but, you know, if you're talking about 3 to 4 tons of carbon dioxide per acre and figure, well, you know, you could sell it just below the $40 tax rate, say $35 a ton, you know, that's $140 an acre revenue. That'll get everyone's attention. Half that gets everyone's attention in the conversation. So any type of cash flow like that into the land that will augment the storage of carbon dioxide is really what I want to see. And I think actually these markets might even develop without the tax itself. I think that carbon neutral push is easy to underestimate, but I really see it gaining strength. And I think the nervousness of the oil and gas industry may also contribute to it as well.
As another recovering Capitol Hill veteran, I also try not to predict how the sausage will get made, but it definitely will get made if it ever happens, and it probably won't be pretty given my experience there. But with that said, I mean, and we as an organization haven't, you know, endorsed any one specific revenue allocation. There are a lot of, you know, competing ideas, from offsetting other taxes, from rebates, which is the Climate Leadership Council, which we're part of as an idea. I mean, likely at the end of the day, it's going to be some combination of all those ideas. Which one has the most political support and wins out will probably be dictated by the politics at the time and what has public support. There is a lot to be said for simplicity, so that the public can understand why the policy makes sense. As a veteran of the Waxman-Markey cap and trade negotiations that failed in Congress, you know, almost a decade ago, the allocation of revenues from that got so complex by the end of it, and it was almost an attempt to, satisfy every special interest possible, and I don't think that was a recipe for success. So I think, but at the end of the day, there are important concerns. There are important concerns from dealing with a variety of equities, whether it's jobs lost in places like coal country, of impacts on low-income individuals. All of those are valid concerns, but will play out in the political process and are important things to consider.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to open it up to the floor. If there are any questions out there. I can't imagine there aren't. So let's start right here. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Frank Elvin. I'm a chemical engineer, and presently we're putting out about 35 gigatons of carbon a year from fossil fuel. And it's shown that we have to reduce, even to maintain present CO2, we have to reduce CO2 emissions by about 16, 17 gigatons a year. Now that can be by reducing emissions or by absorbing CO2 or sequestering it. But if you look at the projections of BP, Statoil, and Total, they show quite clearly that even if we meet the present best case renewable, renewable fuel mandate, and this is data from the Baker Institute over the last couple of months, CO2 is going to continue going up for the next 50 years, and we're going to have a serious problem. Even if we do the best case renewables, we're still going to be putting more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because the population is going to grow, people's expectations are going to grow, and we're going to be using more and more carbon. So I would say we definitely need the carbon tax, but we need to think about adapting the world to the fact that we are going to have a serious problem, and we could take that carbon tax and raise the whole of Houston by 10 feet. I mean, that would be a thing that we could do which will stop the houses where I live in Bel Air flooding. We know it's going to happen. So we have to look at adaptation, and I think that the carbon tax should be used for adapting, and then perhaps in 50 years, hopefully in parallel with going for the different solutions, we'll come to a solution. But in the meantime, we need to adapt.
Jim, real quickly, I think that's a great opening for you to do a pitch about speed, some of the stuff you guys are doing there. So,
Well, I'm with the Severe Storm Center, Speed Center over at Rice University, and we're trying really hard to get our heads around the whole question of prediction of future storms. And I mean, certainly, I'm not sure I'm as pessimistic as you are about the future of climate control and of carbon dioxide control and the emissions, but I think nonetheless we're looking at a future that is going to continue to change, and I think adaptation is going to be incredibly important. I mean, one thing that's very difficult about having this discussion in Houston is everyone that we talk to basically says they don't believe in climate change. The Harris County Flood Control District, the County Commissioners Court, we don't talk climate change in this town. I don't think we talk it in a lot of the United States because it's become such a politicized issue that we can't have an adaptation conversation. I mean, the stuff I'm seeing right now coming out of Kerry Emanuel out of Notre Dame, one of the best modelers around, basically saying the 500-year flood, if you look at a map, a 500-year floodplain, they're saying that's really a 5-year flood. So a storm that used to come once every one in 500 years, they're saying it's now coming once every 5 years. Now, when that information becomes known, I've got to think you're going to start seeing, I think that's where the rebellion of the public comes from. I mean, in Texas, code for climate change is weird weather. If you want to talk about climate change, talk about weird weather. You're talking the same thing. But we don't call it climate change. And I think that that's really a huge problem we've got is we just don't discuss this issue publicly.
somebody else want to comment?
I would just agree that adaptation absolutely has to be a part of the solution. I mean, when we look at how we approach the issue of climate change, we have 3 pillars of how we work on it. It's the mitigation, reducing emissions, the carbon pricing, it's natural climate solutions, it's sequestration, and it's adaptation. Yeah. And they really all have to work together because it is such a challenge. Even if we were to cut off carbon emissions today, there's still likely going to be impacts for many years to come. So we have to deal with that, and it has to be part of it.
In Miami Lakes, one of the stops on this 11 city, 10-week Encourage tour, they don't call it sea level rise, they call it enhanced drainage. So they, literally, like you say, they don't talk about it. The mayor of Miami Lakes told us he can't talk about climate change. If he says climate change, he'll have a rebellion on his hands on city council. Meanwhile, they're pressurizing outflow
to get it to go.
pipes to
Yeah,
get it to
get it
move
flow.
out.
We've
into
got the
bay.
same problem.
And they're putting back flaps on the drainage ditches. And he's got to spend a lot of money doing that, but he can't say that it's because of sea level rise. He's got to say we need enhanced drainage.
In the very back up there.
Yes, I mean, in Canada and Australia, they've made a run at carbon tax. Carbon fee and dividend is the most widely acknowledged good idea that no one will talk out loud about in DC. The recent report by Blackburn and others talk about creative multi-pronged land use. What's the next good idea that's going to be added to the mosaic of approaches or solutions, mitigations, adaptations?
Another way to reframe that is, what is it going to take to actually have action occur? Anybody?
One distinction I think about Australia, I actually spent much of February in Australia because the idea was to have a conservative come there talk, American conservative come talk to Australian conservatives. They're in a very different position than what I said over there at the podium, in that there's such a small economy that their border adjustment just doesn't cause the rest of the world to get in. Our border adjustment does. It's using the strength of the American marketplace to say, you want access? Fine, bring your goods. We like your stuff, like I said over there. It's just going to pay the carbon tax. Australia can't do that. And so they did it, they undid it, they did it, they undid it, and they've had prime ministers come and go because of it. That wouldn't be the case here. And by the way, I think there is a way to put this in Trumpian. I wrote a piece for Real Clear Science where I put a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax, which is something a Secretary of State might call it, like Jim Baker, I'm sure would call it that. It's diplomatic. But you can put it in Trumpian. It goes like this. America's going to act first, and China's going to pay. And they're going to pay our tax on entry, and if they sue us, well, I'm used to being sued. Go right ahead. We're going to beat you in the World Trade Organization. After we beat you, you make your own decisions. You can continue to pay our tax because we've got a deficit in this country, and we'll take your money. Or you might want to do it yourself. You can put it in Trumpian, but it's the same thing, the same concept as a revenue-neutral, border-adjustable carbon tax, which is more diplomatically put.
So I think one of the best ways to think about moving forward and thinking about what the next big thing is something else that Mary Lou brought up, the Mitchell Foundation's obsession with not being obsessed with carbon dioxide. The less we talk about carbon dioxide in most places, the more effective we can be in developing policy solutions for a better energy future more broadly. It just so happens that a better energy future more broadly is also a lower carbon energy future. In DC, we've seen the Committee on Energy and Commerce get pretty excited about what states have been doing in electricity markets, noticing the difference between states like Texas and states like Florida in creating opportunities for people to get better access to cheaper, more reliable power. None of that has to talk about carbon, but it all comes back to carbon. We're seeing a lot of success in talking about the role that hydro should play in the United States. Hydro is pretty cool because it's both a carbon-free source of energy and something impacted by climate change every day. Because of climate change, we're getting less of our power from hydro today than we did 10 years ago. It lets us talk about climate change without talking about climate change. And I think it's something we can all learn. Even environmental advocates can learn to talk about climate change without talking about climate change and gain friends and gain allies in unexpected places. So I think the best new idea in climate policy isn't climate policy.
Go ahead.
I guess just building on what is kind of being kicked around from different angles with the panel, how do you create a sense of urgency around this issue when such a large constituency of politicians and voters are utterly unpersuaded by science or evidence?
Weather, and weather. I think everybody experiences weather. We've all experienced it here in Houston. I think if there's one thing that can penetrate, it's these rains that we've been seeing, the storms we've been seeing. It's all over the country. It's all over the world. we're all seeing weird weather, and it's getting weirder every year. And I think that's going to be I think that's really going to be what will catch the attention and really the fear, if nothing else, of the United States about this issue.
You say that Harvey didn't impact anybody's willingness to talk about climate change?
I'm saying that discussion I've had more people tell me, Blackburn, you're doing really good and you're talking about what to do after Harvey. Please don't mention climate change. I have had at least 15 or 20 emails from prominent Houstonians asking me not to talk about climate change because it would diminish my credibility in being a spokesman about what to do after Harvey. And that's the status of our conversation here. Russ Poppy, who's the director of Harris County Flood Control, has denied that climate change is occurring.
But I think back to the comment earlier is that there are ways to talk about this issue that don't have to address climate change head on that still get to the same solutions. And I mean, we're in many of the places where we're working, whether it's an energy-focused conversation or other conversations, the solutions that people, they may come to it from from a perspective that's not climate-focused, but if they're coming to the same solution, we don't have to beat people over the head because they're not coming to it for the same reason that we're coming to it for.
I get a slightly different take on that. It's like this. I played tennis in high school. And you don't want to run around backhand, right? Once your opponent figures out that you're afraid of getting it in your backhand, they're going to put it in the backhand side of the court every time, right? So that's why at republican.org we say we're a climate realist and energy optimist. And I realize there are a lot of people in this space, particularly that are trying to operate on the right, that say, no, let's talk about clean energy. We don't want to talk about climate change. But we think ultimately we're talking such a big change and such a need for a large change like you were talking about that we have to be talking about climate change at some point. Otherwise, this really, it doesn't, you got to answer the problem at scale. And so I think that's what you were driving at. And so we think that it's about changing the perception, being able to go to them with credible messengers and affirm the truth that conservatives hold dear. Concepts of accountability, concepts of markets, concepts of freedom, of choice, leaving people in the liberty of enlightened self-interest to make their choices. And you can do all that in climate change, but what they've heard so far is this: the godless scientists got together with the UN bureaucrats. They roped in the Wall Street traders. They came up with this hopelessly complicated thing called cap and trade. When that failed, the secret Muslim non-American socialist, he's none of those things, but he came up with a clean power plan, a regulatory solution. There's nothing yet that I've said that's attractive to a conservative. They don't know. No wonder they're not in the conversation. So we have to change that conversation and say, no, it's about this. We're dealing here with solution aversion. If you don't think there's a solution to your problem, you will doubt the existence of your problem. And that sounds irrational, but what we've got to all admit is every one of us does it every day. Here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to remove your head. After you've got your head off, we work on your spine and put your head back on. Thanks, Doc. I'm feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem. And the solution is nuts. You're not going to take my head off. The solution is nuts. You're not going to regulate my very breath through the Clean Power Plan. It wouldn't have done that, but that was a perception on Fox and Friends. You're not going to create this enormous UN bureaucracy thing about cap and trade. Wasn't exactly UN, but you know what I'm talking about. In other words, that's the whole. So the solution, if it's in that milieu, is completely unacceptable to conservatives. So we've got to change that and show them some clips of Milton Friedman saying on the Phil Donahue show in the 80s, "What do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman?" says Phil Donahue to Milton Friedman. He says, "Well, you tax it, of course." And then he goes on to explain internalizing negative externalities, and that's what I was doing, for example, last night to students at Texas A&M, and they were getting it. Yeah, that makes sense to us. Put all the costs in, eliminate all the subsidies. Let's see how the free enterprise system deals with it. Right, then you've got something that conservatives can warm to and can get in the conversation.
That was the most ridiculous thing I've heard anybody say.
Can you please sit down, sir?
Please sit down, sir.
Sir, please sit down.
So let me just make a couple of comments, because I happen to have been in this space for probably longer than most of you except for Bob. The first is, Houston in particular has done a great job in terms of reducing both NOx and VOCs in the Texas six-county area, far superior than people ever expected to have done. And so when I started the business back in 2002, 2/3 of the pollution in this town came from stationary sources. In the arc of 8 years, 9 years, we switched it. It's 2/3 now from mobile sources, 1/3 from stationary sources. And if you just think about the NOx conversion of around 280, depending on who you're talking to, 240 to 300, you've done a pretty good job in terms of getting regulatory impact on people who get it. The Lyondales get the carbon tax, the Exxons get the carbon tax, but most of the problem has been education, and most of the problem has been because we do not have what used to be known as the fairness doctrine in terms of educating what is actually the physical impact. Your externalities don't mean anything to anybody if they only have a high school degree. Tell them that their kids are suffering from pulmonary problems, they have asthma, and they start to pay attention. Can't run out on ozone days, they can make it makes a big point. Tell them that during Harvey, when everything was shut down, we had a high incidence day because there were 200 maritime vessels offshore and 10,000 trucks trying to get into town. Makes a big difference.
Wow.
So when you talk about CO2, it's really important to make it simple enough for them to digest it. And the carbon tax, as correct as it is hard for them to digest. It's an example right there. Right?
Yeah.
And it's not just our politicians who are uneducated. They're in denial because they can't go back and explain to people the cost of health care, the cost of medicine, the cost of breathing. Unless you've affected it, you can't do it. So we believe in markets for Republicans, or at least I am. I'm sort of recovering Republican these days, but I would probably. But to your point, free markets don't really work. They're savage, they're brutal, they rape Europe, bad bureaucracies, bad decisions in the United States. We've done a lot of things in terms of markets. They are not always friendly. But in this particular case, there's enough data, to Bob's point, to impose a material balance. Almost anybody in engineering and most science people get material balance. Nobody talks about material balances. I don't understand why you don't talk about the material balances about production of units. People get that. So help me understand why you're not pressing this to the crowds who really are going to pick up the phones and call their congressman. Culberson is never going to go for a carbon tax until you throw his ass out.
Well, how about though if he hears really intensely from ExxonMobil?
No. Have you ever been on one of his town hall calls?
No. He's a friend from my time in Congress, but
just do it once and you'll never go back.
But what do you think?
You have to have an educational system or a message that is simple enough for people to actually digest. And the concrete results that have already been demonstrated by efficacy. And the fact that the whole world, the FedExes, the UPSs, the Postal Service, are all trying to green their transport lines. This is a major thing that's been going on. UPS just spent another $250 million to green their transport. So the social function has taken 10 years, 15 years for people to put into their corporate doctrines of greening and social responsibility is only coming into play here. I'm pretty convinced in 10 years, Houston's going to have pretty damn clean air because we're going to figure out a way to use CNG instead of diesel. We're going to have Detroit Electric, by the way, owned by the Chinese, and it's the oldest electric brand in the world. Okay, they bought it last year, or maybe early this year. They're going to be producing more batteries in Detroit than Elon Musk can do in a day. Mm-hmm. So your innovation is correct, but the message is really hard because you don't make it simple enough for them to eat. That's my sort of complaint. Because I'll remind you that you told me this a year ago.
Huh.
You told me before they don't like the tax.
Yeah. Right. It's true, but if you explain it to them in terms of accountability.
They don't care if it's Christian. They don't care if it's Genesis. They don't care. They are in denial of what's taking place in the world around us.
Yeah, because it's
And you cannot get through the denial unless you can bring it to their family.
right. It's culturally marked, right, in that way, right?
Jim is talking about something that's been done in Canada for the last 15 years in Alberta, because I've traded Canadian soil credits.
Mm-hmm.
This is, all he has to do is pick up the telephone or look on them, and he can pull out the whole protocols. It's ABC, and it's accepted in at least 10 different countries, including California in some places. So there are things out there, but we don't have a way to articulate this in a way that's meaningful to the 8-year-old. And most of the people we talk to are 8-year-olds.
So I'll throw something out there because I think this is actually important. This is actually important for the discussion. It's easy to castigate people's level of education in discussing the issues. And when you do that, you immediately alienate them and they'll never engage in the conversation with you again. Okay? No, wait. I know, but wait a second. Let me finish. What's important, you're absolutely right. Education is incredibly important. And I think that should be your core message, is how do you actually convey this so that it becomes actionable to a broad constituency?
Newspapers are written to 8th graders. That's the level of education. Not
Well-
because they're dumb, it's because it's a simple way to digest in a very busy world.
I think that's the point. Look, there's something we talk about in the policy community all the time. What's your 30-second elevator speech, right? If you can't do it in a 30-second elevator pitch, then you've lost the argument already, right? So I think that's really the point that needs to be made. But I think that can be made in a simpler way, right? And that's actually what I would suggest be the sort of marching order going forward in trying to come up with policies to address climate, be it a tax, be it a cap and trade, whatever it is, right? You've got to think of the 30-second elevator pitch. Dan.
One thing I found fascinating that no one said on this panel, until just one word was said, and that was the word pollution. I mean, that's what this is really all about, is pollution. People understand pollution. People don't like pollution. Your universal pitch is pollution. We used to understand it. We set up lots of regulations to stop it, and to a certain extent, that's been very successful. The average Joe is going to understand, no, I don't want my air polluted. I don't want to have emphysema. I don't want to have these problems that are, hurting my children. That's very understandable. You start throwing in these convoluted forms of taxation and sequestrations and everything else, and you really do lose the public. And the politicians have a field day with it because they can write it in such ways that it never comes out and makes any sense. But if you just concentrate on, we got to stop polluting this world because it's killing us, no one can argue that. No one can argue that it's good to dump waste in the water. You can't say, oh, that's fine. They did do it back in the 20s because they didn't understand the consequences. As Sylvia Earle used to say, we didn't know then, but we do know now. So we put in pollution controls on cars because we understand, this is hurting us. So we need to start stopping that. We defend the old industries because they really didn't understand the impact, and they didn't. We understand the impact now, and we title it climate change. That's what's really happening, is climate change. But we've already said you lose the audience because they said, oh, well, Krakatoa was climate change. It covered the earth with ashes for 20 years, and we all survived that. So you take that out of the discussion and you throw in the bottom line to it. It's pollution, period, end of discussion. And no one's going to say, well, pollution's good. We got to keep pollution. It's good for the economy. You'll never hear that argument.
Well, Mr. Pruitt did actually.
Well, hold on. In the very back. Dan, go ahead.
There was an article that came out this week in The Atlantic that argued that Democrats aren't ready to win on climate. That, with Republican and with Climate Leadership Council, we know how retired Republicans would act on climate, but that Democrats could be set up for a situation like Republicans not being ready to repeal and replace Obamacare. So if the Democrats were to win all three branches in 2021? Where are the best ideas coming from? What would it look like for a democratic solution to climate change?
I would
Go
just
ahead.
note that I think from our perspective, the wrong way to look at it is that should there be a Democratic or a Republican solution? If there's not a kind of the whatever party plus one vote model of trying to get it through probably is not sustainable. And the way we look at it is it has to be durable and sustainable. And so that's why you need support across the political spectrum to achieve anything that's going to meet that test. And so whichever party is in power, I think trying to find solutions where there is common ground and there's an agreement that that is the way to address the problem is kind of one of our fundamental principles, because we believe that's the only way that it remains sustainable. Otherwise, it's subject to the just constant pendulum swinging back and forth from one view to another.
You know, I mean, on the one hand, I've been unimpressed with anything I've heard from the Democratic side on this issue, so I tend to, just share a concern about that. But one thing I would say that's sort of gotten overlooked a little bit is at least some of the things that we're talking about with the sequestration system is the fact that the market system itself may actually be moving in a direction right now. And it may be sending signals, and I think if you disregard those signals as an oil company, you're going to put yourself in jeopardy in the long run. And I think that's really where, the conversation that I've been interested in having and have been having is more so with the oil company personnel and with the people that are making decisions from a strategic standpoint of what's the future of the oil company look like, rather than the people that may have to vote on passing a tax. That's where you're going to have to be, you're in that milieu. I'm talking to people that are incredibly well educated, that know this issue backwards and forwards, and just trying to figure out from a strategic standpoint when they're going to have to make a move. And it's beginning to happen. And I think that is something, do not underestimate that. I actually think that's much more powerful, and I think it may be, in many respects, more persuasive than some of the other things that are happening right now.
Yeah, Jim, thank you for bringing that up. So, yeah, I don't think that what we need to figure out is what the Democrats are going to do on greenhouse gas emissions. They've had 2 bites at the apple, and they've blown it. So the BTU tax didn't go through, and the Obama White House didn't do anything. A politically motivated solution from one party isn't going to do it, but companies are making changes every day. When I was at the Art Street Institute, I spent a lot of time out in the states with companies who were petitioning the state legislature to let them buy as much renewable power as they wanted in state. A lot of states don't let companies express this kind of preference. And so you had companies like Walmart and GE thinking about locating their businesses in different states than they were currently located, simply because they didn't have access to the kind of cheap power they wanted. Now, that's pretty scary when you're a state legislature and you're talking to a big job creator and they're saying that their expansion plans don't include your neighborhood. And this, I think, is the difference maker. The market is leading. Policy is going to follow. But how do we help the market make these decisions? We don't have the full infrastructure in place now, but it doesn't take a carbon solution to let the market make these choices. It takes energy policy.
Right.
It's a lot easier.
Right. And the other thing I think, in hearing the comment, one thing I worry about is whether what you're doing may actually screw up the market being developed and making sure they're compatible. I think Ken raised that point early on about making sure they all are compatible with each other, because there are things that are underway that, carbon tax could either inhibit or help. And so, we just want to make sure that those things are consistent. So that worries me a little bit. I mean, if my people could trade and use that, get credit against the tax for sequestering, then I'm fine with it. If it doesn't qualify, then it doesn't help them, and they won't sequester.
So I know there are more questions. There's going to be a reception to follow. We're actually up against it, but I'm going to put one of my colleagues on the spot because he had a piece published in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week, Ted Timsalides. The messaging in that about your sort of renewable world, right? In particular, the hearkening back to the movement from the 18 to 1900s. Can you just briefly sort of expound on that? Because I think it has a tremendous relevance to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks, yeah.
Sure.
Well, the example we used in that article was the example of there's really no nice way of saying it, horse manure. Horse manure was a big problem. It was a result of the means of transportation around the 1900s in New York. Other big cities, London. At the time, people were speculating about how many, they were looking at the population patterns, immigration in New York City, population growth, and they were speculating how many horse manure, feet of horse manure they would be covered under, given the growth that would be needed in transportation. What they didn't see is that the free market offered an innovation. It was the internal combustion engine that solved that problem, created other problems like the ones we're discussing right now. It solved that problem. That was not the result of subsidies or any kind of government intervention. It was the free market that did it. In fact, one thing we point, if I may point one more thing in the article, is that the steam engine automobiles came before the internal combustion automobiles. So if at the time, desperate for some innovation that would get us outside this horse manure problem, the government subsidized steam engine automobiles, which would have been a dead end anyway, all it would have done is actually delay the innovation that saved us from that problem, again, created others. So that's a bottom line in that article. And we have a belief that free market can offer good solutions to problems like this.
One thing that I'd add there is if the city of New York had required owners to haul the manure off of the island, as for example in Charleston, South Carolina now, if you have a horse, you got to have a diaper for that horse because the city doesn't sweep anymore the manure. So as long as the city of New York subsidized the externalization of those negative externalities by allowing your horse to poop and they'd clean it up, but if you say to the owner, you take it off this island, Henry Ford would have sold cars much faster, right? Because people would say, I don't want to take this stuff off the island. So that's what we do right now. We don't bring that accountability. That's not very highfalutin, right? I could say that. I mean, in other words, we can talk manure.
All right, so with that, I want to close and join me in thanking the panelists for participating.
I do, yes.
Yeah, tell her hi for me.
I will.
Lynn worked with us down here on some of our work on this concept as well as the other. So.
Great. Oh, great. Yeah, it's very aligned with what we're